This feature tutorial will demonstrate how to use our two additive synthesizers. The A+2 synthesizer was included as part of the May 29th content update and introduces a new design and additional features that make it more intuitive to use and more functional than the original additive module. A+2 was going to be released as an update and replacement to the additive synthesizer, but since its new options make it more computationally expensive, I've decided to keep the original module for use on computers with slower processors. Since these two synthesizers are very similar in function, use of each will be demonstrated simultaneously in this video, with A+2's additional features being reviewed at the end. Both synthesizers are accessible from the Instruments section of the module list. I've gone ahead and loaded an instance of each module into a new pedal board so that we can make a side-by-side comparison of how they function. Immediately, we can observe some visual differences. The keyboards are different colors to make them easily distinguishable from each other. You'll also notice that the A+2 synth includes a waveform display as well as several tabs and an overall darker aesthetic. The original additive synth uses a slightly lighter look and includes all of its features in a single display. The arpeggio tools have been removed from A+2, but our new MIDI arpeggiator module can be used instead to provide an even more robust and customizable selection of patterns for these or any of the other instruments. Clicking on the tabs in A+2 reveals more options for the user. The Envelope tab includes the original Amplitude Envelope slider that we can see in the additive module, plus a new envelope slider that will be used for the LFO controls. Clicking on the LFO tab reveals a new set of features in the form of two customizable low-frequency oscillators that can be used to add frequency or amplitude modulation to any combination of the three carrier waveforms. We'll come back to this feature later in the video. For now, I'll move back to the Waveforms tab, where we'll get started with a proper demonstration. Starting from the default settings, both instruments should sound identical. For example, playing the A above middle C will result in the same sound regardless of which synthesizer is selected. The one immediate difference between the two is the display included between the keyboard and A+2 that gives the user a visual representation of the outgoing sound. This can be a lot of fun to play with, and different pitch combinations can look surprisingly artful at times. The most important first step of building a sound in any synthesizer is selecting the right carrier waves for the timbre you're trying to craft. Both synthesizers contain the same carrier wave options, although the display in A+2 makes it easier to understand the controls. The user begins with a simple sine wave, but this can be swapped out for one of the other 31 options. Each waveform is distinct and provides a slightly different starting point for our sound. Although we begin with one waveform, we may use up to 3 simultaneously, and turning on the second and third carriers is as easy as selecting the wave shape you'd like to use and turning up the volume. I'll demonstrate this now by mixing 3 shapes together. Again, this can be done in either instance of the synthesizer. The rest of the waveform controls provide more options for the selected frequency of the waveform. Choosing a different partial from the list will multiply the frequency so that it instead plays a pitch from the overtone series. Setting waveforms to play overtones can result in some nice subtle complexity, but keep in mind overtones are traditionally much quieter than the fundamental, so to make this believably one note, you'll want to turn the volume down on these. If you want a thicker timbre, you might consider offsetting one or more waveform by a few synths. Each pitch can be raised or lowered by up to 100 synths, at which point the note will actually be a half step above or below the currently selected pitch. Raising or lowering a pitch by less than 100 synths will result in a slightly sharper if raised or flatter if lowered frequency. Here I'll demonstrate how changing the synth tuning can result in a subtly denser sound. Finally, we can offset any of the waveforms by one or more octaves in either direction. Lowering one or more waveforms by an octave or two is a great way to create a rich and thick bass sound. Raising a waveform, on the other hand, might be exactly what we need to generate a melody that cuts through the surrounding texture. So far I've used the A+2 to demonstrate how these controls work, but let's quickly see how to access this on the original Additive Synthesizer. The left-hand column is dedicated to the carrier waves. Every two rows relate to a different form. The upper left menu allows you to select the form you want to work with, and you can control the volume with the knob just to the right of the form selection menu. The end of the top row is dedicated to partial selection. The left number box in the bottom row provides you with synth detuning, and the right number box allows us to offset the octave. Just like the A+2, we have three sets of waveforms we can work with, and all of the same controls are available, they've just been compressed to save space. Next, we'll look at the Amplitude Envelope, which can help us craft the shape of the sound over time. The Amplitude Envelope is found on the right-hand side of the original synthesizer, and on the left-hand side of the Envelopes tab on the A+2 synth. The Amplitude Envelope determines the volume of the sound over the duration of the note, and breaks it down into its four component sections: the attack, decay, sustain, and release portion. This is a traditional ADSR envelope, and people familiar with synthesis design should know a bit about this already. For everyone else, the attack is the amount of time it takes for the note to swell to its full volume when the key is pressed. The release, on the other end, is the amount of time it takes for the note to decay back to silence when the key is released. The sustain value is how loud the note will be while the key is held down. Finally, the decay is the amount of time it takes to decay down to the sustained value after the attack has finished. Each value is represented as a separate slider, and all four can be changed at any time, even affecting a note while it's sustaining. To demonstrate, let's look at the default values. A short attack means that the note will swell up to full volume quickly, while a short release means that the note will decay quickly once the key is lifted. A full sustain will keep the volume high, and a short decay will make for a quick move down to the sustained volume after the attack. This is what we've been hearing so far during this demonstration. Let's see what happens if we try some different values. I'll make the attack value nice and long so that we get a gradual swell to the entrance of the note. I'll make the release similarly long so that the note takes a while to taper off. Let's listen to that now. Next, I'll increase the decay time, but lower the sustain value. After the attack finishes, the volume will begin to taper off, but it won't disappear completely. On the other end of the spectrum, we can use these controls to make very short, percussive sounds. If our attack is quick and our release even quicker, we'll get something like our default, although the decay and sustain are different, so the note will be quieter while held down. If we proceed to drop the sustain and decay out completely, we'll get something much shorter that will come to an end quickly on its own. We can even simulate a reverse swell by leaving all of the envelope values down but raising our attack to a high value. This will create a gradual increase in volume that quickly clicks off at the end of the swell. Unlike the original synth, A+2 includes an additional envelope to control the shape of the low-frequency oscillators over the duration of the note, but we'll come back to this later. At this point, we've observed all of the features in common with both versions of the synthesizer. Now I'd like to cover the features that are unique to each tool. The original additive synth includes an arpeggiator. As mentioned before, this has been left out of the new synth because our new arpeggiator module replaces and improves upon the functionality of this feature. We didn't see any reason to remove this option from the original synth, So let's take a moment to look at it now. Pressing the View Arpeggiator button opens a new window that includes the arpeggiator controls. With the tool toggle on, the arpeggiator takes any notes that are currently being depressed on the keyboard and generates new patterns from those notes. If I press a few keys on the keyboard and turn the toggle on, we'll hear an initial pattern. Notice that as soon as the arpeggiator is turned off, the notes are sustained again on the keyboard. I'll leave the arpeggiator on for now. Clicking the drop-down menu below the toggle gives us access to different patterns. The trigger rate controls how quickly new notes are generated, while the note duration determines how long each note sustains. The trigger chance determines how likely new notes are to generate, based on a chance out of 100%. Chances are determined in a sequence of 4 rolls. The number of octaves box will allow you to generate patterns from the notes in the selected octave, or to stretch your patterns across up to 4 octaves, with the original octave at the bottom. Finally, the up-down arrow allows us to shift our octave up or down. This covers all of the features of the included arpeggiator. The separate arpeggiator module is much more flexible, but that tool will be discussed in another video. Now, let's look at the additional tools available in the A+2 synth. Switching over to the LFO tab, we can see the controls for our 2 low-frequency oscillators. This is another tool set that should be very familiar to synthesis veterans, but I'll discuss this concept in a very basic way for people who may not be familiar with what an LFO can do. Low-frequency oscillators are, as the name suggests, waveforms that oscillate at a low speed, traditionally at 20 cycles per second or less. You may know that waveforms occurring at this rate are too slow for our ears to hear, but the signal from LFOs are actually used to manipulate the patterns of carrier waveforms, which are the waves that we do hear. The name LFO is a slight misnomer, since creators often get interesting results by turning the rate of the waveform above the 20 cycles per second range. Regardless, the name has stuck, and is used to refer to any wave that functions to modulate either a carrier wave or some form of control data. When an A+2 LFO runs, the signal can be used to affect either the frequency or amplitude of one or more of the carrier waves. These manipulations are referred to respectively as frequency and amplitude modulation. Frequency modulation is comparable to vibrato, which will cause the pitch to wiggle up and down around the selected frequency. Amplitude modulation is similar to tremolo, which will cause the sound to vary in volume. Each LFO can be toggled on by flipping the button to the on position. The mode is set to frequency modulation by default, but the menu can be used to select amplitude if that's the process you want. Like the carrier waves, you can select the waveform for the LFO, and different waveforms will produce slightly different results. Finally, you'll want to select which carrier wave or waves are affected by the LFO. Once these decisions are made, you'll want to set the rate and depth for the LFO. The rate is the speed at which the LFO oscillates, while the depth is the size of the oscillation. Depth is only used in frequency modulation, and this parameter will be ignored when amplitude modulation is selected. Let's listen to an example of how this works. I'll set the rate down to 5 Hz, and I'll set the depth to 5. Notice how the waveform wobbles a little bit, about 5 times a second. Now I'll increase the depth to 100. And we can see that the wobble just got a lot bigger. Now I'll show you what happens as we increase the rate of wobble. As the rate value increases, the speed of the wobble decreases until it becomes high enough that the waveform becomes completely transformed. If we choose a different shape, we can hear how different LFO waveforms affect the resulting sound. Now I'll activate the other 2 carrier waveforms again. Notice that the second and third waveforms are not affected by the LFO. I can select which waveform I want the LFO to apply to, or I can select multiple waveforms to change. Finally, let's take a quick listen to the amplitude modulation. I'll set the rate down to 2 and switch over. Notice that this gives our notes a pulsed sound. This will continue until we increase the rate enough, at which point it will affect the sound similarly to the high-speed frequency modulation. We have one last feature to look at, and that's the LFO envelope. Back over on the Envelope tab, on the right side is the envelope that controls the amount of change the LFO produces over time. We have the same 4 parameters as the Amplitude envelope, but now these will apply to the LFO over the duration of the note. For example, if we set the attack duration high on the LFO envelope, the LFO will come in gradually at the beginning of the note. If we only want the LFO at the beginning of the note, we can set the attack low, then introduce a quick decay and a sustain of 0. Finally, by setting a long release for the amplitude and the LFO envelopes, you can get an effect where the LFO fades out at the end of the note. This covers most of the main features of the synthesizer, but I'll very quickly touch on the remaining options. The visual display can be tweaked by changing the buffer size of the display, as well as the number of samples per pixel. This doesn't have any effect on the resulting sound, just on the visual display. In very rare occasions, a note may get caught in the synthesizer. If this happens, hitting flush will clear all the notes, including the caught ones. When using the included keyboard to play the synthesizer, you can change the octave plus or minus value to reach higher and lower notes above the current display. If you prefer to use your own hardware keyboard or the included virtual keyboard, make sure that the control toggle is turned on. This will allow the synthesizer to listen for input from hardware or virtual controllers. The View Routing List button will display the routing parameters for each control of the synthesizer, so that you know what parameter number you need to utilize when building automation for the module. The remaining parts of the A+2 and Additive Synthesizer, like the preset box, the output options, etc., are all covered in the introductory tutorials, so we won't retread those topics here. Each instrument in Music STP is incredibly versatile. The additive synthesizers are perhaps the most traditional instruments in our toolbox, but also possibly capable of making the most diverse and most malleable set of sounds. These tools are perfect for crafting bright leads, pumping basses, far-out pads, and much more. With a little exploration, you'll see that there are a huge number of possibilities with these synthesizers, and sending the signal into other modules can help you craft even more impressive sounds. But we'll save that idea for another video. If you learned something from this video and appreciate our free tools, click the like button below the video. If you want to become a patron to our project, follow the link to our Patreon page in the description below this video. Finally, if you want to learn more about the music and sound design platform and wish to download a free copy of the program, visit the link to our website, www.musicsdp.com, in the description below this video. I hope you found this tutorial helpful, and keep your eyes peeled for more software updates, blog posts, demos, and videos at musicsdp.com. Thanks for watching.